Hello and welcome to Old Bird New Tricks. I am Amanda Pennick and welcome to the new page. Hopefully you guys are able to find the new location and switch over without a problem. The Old Bird New Tricks page is primarily dedicated to novice parrot companions or people who have had their birds for a while but are just now looking into some of the other aspects of care and enrichment. So keep that in mind as you watch the videos. They're often geared towards an audience that might not have a lot of knowledge. My goal is to make a page that people who are just learning feel safe to come and ask some of the questions that they might not be able to find the answers to on other pages. The internet is full of source information about parrots. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. And a lot of it, if you're newer to parrots, then you might not realize that you should even be looking up some of this information. So that's kind of where I'm going with Old Bird. Certainly if you have lots of parrot experience, please, you're welcome to join the group and offer advice and help when I'm not on and you see questions coming up. It's always appreciated that the community stick together and help each other. Today's topic is on hormones. And again, if you're a more experienced parrot person, stick through to the end. We're going to start with talking about what hormones are and what the body language and behavior of a hormonal bird looks like. Then we're going to get into some of the behavioral issues that can happen and also triggers and how to potentially avoid setting off your bird's hormones. So to start, hormones are the body's chemistry. It's the way that your body regulates itself. They're always active in the body, yours, your bird's. But when parrot companions are talking about a hormonal bird, they're looking at or they're discussing a bird that has an increased sex drive, all right? You have to remember that in the wild, parrots and other animals, their primary goal is to reproduce and pass on their genetics. And the birds that we have in our home are only a few generations out of the wild, or in some cases have actually come straight from the wild. So the instinct to pass on their genetics is still very strong. And as parrot companions, that's something that we have to be aware of and deal with. And even if you do every one of my suggestions and you have a perfect environment in home, your bird is likely still at some point in their life going to have a surge in hormones. You can't fight nature forever, and when they do happen, you just kind of have to be a little more sensitive of your bird's demands and temperament and push through it, because once the surge is done, you're going to have your bird back. It will end. A lot of birds you'll see on the online sites getting rehomed around their adolescence time. So for conures, this is around 2 years old. For ringnecks, this is between 1.5 years, 2 years. Macaws in that at 5 and then again at 10. And this is a lot of the times due to some of the behaviors that they start showing when they have their hormone surges. And they can be quite difficult to work with, and it can be startling if you're not aware that this is something you have to consider. All right, so that is kind of what hormones are and what people are referring to when they say they have a hormonal bird. What does a hormonal bird look like? So what does a bird who wants to reproduce look like? These are birds that some species have special dances. So if you have an Indian ringneck, they have a quite neat, it's called heart wings display. Other birds might droop their wings forward. The first time I saw an African gray displaying mating behaviors. I was concerned he was having breathing problems because they hunch right forward and their wings droop. In other species, if you saw that, you would think that they were sick. Regurgitating is a huge one. Now, regurgitating, some species, again, do it more often than others. Some species regurgitate to their fellow flock members, so it's not necessarily strictly a mating behavior. And this is where reading up and knowing the bird that you have in your house is going to help you decide whether it's a mating behavior or it's just a flocking behavior. Panting, cockatoos are really big for this one. A happy cockatoo does this cute little tongue wiggle, but when they get really surged up, they'll actually start panting, and you'll see the chest heaving in and out. Shivering and quaking, sitting really low on the perch or your hand and rubbing their vent, essentially masturbating. It does happen in birds. It's quite amusing to me when I see some videos of, look what my bird's doing, isn't that cute? And you're like, yeah. Plucking can actually occur. A lot of the times, if it occurs due to hormones, it's in females, and it's the chest and leg area. And this is because females of some species pad their nest for their eggs with their feathers. What else do we have? Contact calls and screaming might increase. Nesting behaviors, so they might constantly be looking and going into the closet or under the ledge of your counters, under clothing, in your shirt, essentially small dark places. Also happy huts, tunnels, under the newspaper. They might just choose a corner of the cage and start getting very aggressive and territorial in that area. And so I'm starting to get into why hormones can be a problem with your birds. Hormonal surges can bring on excessive screaming, plucking, and also what most owners would call aggression. So they might get very territorial and lunge and bite around their cage, but they also, if they see you, their person, or somebody else in the house, or an object in the house as their mate, they could be more prone to bite around that object. And if you're the mate, they might bite other people who try to get close to you, or they might actually bite you and chase you because they want to get you away from what they perceive as a threat to the relationship or just a threat in general. So obviously when birds have hormone surges, it can be difficult to live with because your normally sweet, cuddly bird is now a little monster. And a lot of novice owners are startled by what can seem an overnight change in behavior. And if they don't do their research or they haven't been around this before, they might not realize that, in a few weeks' time you will have your bird back. But in the meantime, you have to deal with these new behaviors. Ideally, you would avoid a lot of the triggers and prevent these bouts from occurring all the time. Now, this is going to depend a lot on your individual bird. Some birds rarely have issues with hormones. You can do every single one of the triggers, and 90% of its life, the bird's going to be a happy-go-lucky bird, and it's not going to be a problem. Some birds can get their hormones revved up and they don't become aggressive. So you still end up having a sweet, cuddly, even more cuddly than normal bird that isn't screaming and plucking and biting. And if that's the case, consider yourself very lucky. And on the flip side, you can have birds that you look at them funny and they start panting. There's certain body chemistry where a bird can be very, very attracted to a specific person, and all that person has to do is pick the bird up, and the bird will start panting and rubbing themselves. So it can go both ways. Ideally, you're in the earlier side where very little sets your bird off, and you don't have to be as strict with the triggers. But like I said, if your bird does happen to have a hormone surge, and if your bird does happen to start having some behavioral issues with it, Don't beat yourself up. It happens, even to the best care providers, and often to the best care providers. And we'll get into that when we get into triggers, which we're doing now. A lot of what we do in our home is looking after our birds. It's making a nice, welcome environment for our birds. In the wild, birds don't really work like humans do. Okay? Obviously, the female of humans has a very strict monthly cycle, and when we can have babies is on regular rotation. But with birds in the wild, their hormones will be triggered when the environment is right for reproduction, to give their chicks the strongest chance of survival. So their body doesn't run on a regular monthly cycle. It uses environmental cues to decide when to kick those hormones into drive and say it's mating season. Some of the triggers, one of the big ones is touching. This can happen a lot with cockatoos and cockatiels, because often if they're friendly with you, they'll allow you to pet them all over. But there's certainly other species that and other birds that can be set off by this. When you're touching your bird, you only want to pet the head, the back of the neck, and the feet. The rest of the body, especially stroking down the back and under the wings and near the vent, are reserved for the mate. So by touching your bird in these areas, you're telling your bird, yes, I will mate with you, I approve of your courtship, let's get going. And so not only are you potentially making these hormone levels elevate, you're also confusing the bird, because obviously you can't follow through with what you've agreed to. And these frustrations can start to result in some of the behavior problems because you have a sexually frustrated bird. As a side note, a lot of people start seeing these behaviors, and their suggestion that they find online or by friends is to get a mate for their bird. And I don't agree with this necessarily, because there's no guarantee they're going to get along, and if they do get along, what are you going to do with the offspring? You might become less in your bird's eyes. There's a good chance that if they mate, you as the human are now the interloper in the relationship. And remember, hormonal birds can get quite aggressive to people in the environment that are around their mate. So that'll change your dynamic of living with your bird. And also, your bird's just sexually frustrated. They're going to get over it. There are problems that can occur from too high of a surge or too prolonged of a surge in hormones and some of the behaviors, and we'll get into that. But generally speaking, your bird will get through it and do just fine without having to reproduce. So yes, when you're touching head, neck, feet, try reserve it to that. Even if your bird really seems to enjoy when you pet them or when they snuggle in, it's really tough. As humans, we seem programmed to want to sit there and snuggle and pet an animal that lets us. And the argument I get against what I'm saying is, oh, well, he really seems to enjoy it. Yeah, he does really seem to enjoy it because you're pleasuring him or her. So that is one of the main triggers. Another one is various diet. Soft, warm foods for some birds can be a trigger. I'm not saying don't feed your bird soft foods. Often it's a great way to get your bird to eat things that they wouldn't normally eat by blending it up. But when you're feeding the soft foods, it's a good idea to have it room temperature or cooler, because then you're not imitating the regurgitation. So then, aside from soft, warm foods, there's also high carbs and high protein diets can set birds off. If you think your bird is being set off by the high carb, high protein, take a look at the pellets that you're feeding. Some pellets are higher proteins than others. If you're feeding a lot of seed, bready things, cookies, and that with the sugar and carbs in them, that can actually be a trigger for your bird, because in the wild, their body is looking for an environment that has lots of nutrients. You know, it's a land of plenty. This is a good spot. You'll be able to find lots of food for your babies without going very far. One of the things that can happen when you first get a bird in your home, especially if it's been in a less than ideal environment, it's now in your home and you're feeding it properly, a lot of people will find a hormone surge once the bird has settled in. It can get quite hormonal, and this can often be because A, it's safe. It's now got the land of plenty. It's got so much more food available to it than it potentially had in its previous environment, and it's got somebody looking after it regularly. So whether your bird came from a pet shop or a hoarding situation, or, I mean, there's unfortunately tons of examples of where your bird wouldn't have been getting a large variety of fresh fruit and vegetables in with their regular diet, as well as a lot of contact with somebody it might see as a mate. So that's one thing to be aware of. What else? Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Exposure to certain people. As I said, sometimes birds just fall in love with a particular person, and there are times of the year that that person might not be able to spend a lot of time with the bird. There's a cockatoo at Parrot Partner named Crackers, and right now she seems to be fine and I can spend a lot of time with her. But in the spring, I only spend about 5-10 minute intervals with her, because any longer than that and she'll start panting and showing visible signs of wanting to rub herself on me. And I mean, I keep my hands in appropriate spaces and we're very careful with the triggers, but there's just something about her and I's chemistry where being around me is a trigger. So if you happen to be the owner or the companion of a parrot and you are the trigger, this is where you're going to have to be very careful with not encouraging things like the masturbation and the regurgitation. And when it happens, I mean, don't get mad and upset or grossed out. Just smile, turn your back, walk away, and make sure your bird knows that, you know, you love them, but it's not that kind of relationship. What else do we have? Oh, access to nest areas. So this can be a big one for some birds, and other birds seem like they can shred boxes and paper all day long and it's not going to be a trigger. You really need to watch for patterns and know your individual bird. If your bird is going into a particular cupboard or bathroom or under the couch and actively seeking dark places, they're looking for nesting spaces. And at first it's usually not a behavior problem because the bird's just kind of checking things out. But if you let the bird continually play in these areas, they can start getting quite possessive and territorial and, you know, sneaking out from under the couch to bite any feet that come near, not stepping up willingly, and a lot of things like that, because now that they found a nice nest spot, their body's telling them to protect it and keep it. In the cage, if you have a bird that has nesting tendencies, you're going to want to avoid boxes and huts and shredding paper, anything that the bird might see as a nest. Again, this is very individualized. My budgies, for example, get crinkle paper and they have a birdie bagel tube that they go in, and I've been very lucky with them not having surges in hormones. But other people's budgies, if they have access to fibrous stuff or shredding paper, that can be enough to set them off. So you have to kind of watch your bird, and if you start seeing a pattern or a regular occurrence of strong hormone surges, start looking at the environment, and by elimination of these triggers, hopefully we can curb the behavior before it becomes a problem behavior. So other ways we have to help include expending the energy. So if your bird is starting to behave in a way that you think that they're becoming hormonal, one of the really good things you can do is just tire them out. So if they like to dance, have dance parties, do recall training and encourage a lot of flight in the house. If they don't fly, you can do wing flapping exercises with them, play with their favorite toy, essentially occupy their time and help distract them and spend the energy. So by the time they go back to their cage for the evening or to their favorite perch in the afternoon, they're ready for a nap, or that extra pent-up energy and frustration has been spent with other physical activity. If your bird does start to be grumpy or starts coming on to you, remember, be calm and understanding. Don't be mad at yourself or at the bird. It's just nature running its course. Be careful, if your bird is being more prone to biting on your hands, this is where having them trained to step up on a towel or a stick can be really helpful. Also, if you know that you're a trigger for your bird and they start showing some of the body language that they're feeling hormonal, using a perch to pick them up and move them around that way and staying more hands off can help calm these hormones down. Once it surges, you want to start avoiding the triggers. Ideally, you've been avoiding some of them before it happens, but certainly once they start acting like they want to breed, the more of these that you can avoid, the better, because it'll actually help bring the hormones down in the bird once the environment's not ideal. Light is a really big one. Outside, there's seasonal changes, right? So in the spring, the days are getting longer, and the days are getting warmer, and that's a huge trigger for some species. So making sure your bird gets the 10 to 14 hours, depending on the species, of dark, quiet sleep each night is really important. My own birds, I've said, go to bed around 6 and 7 at night, but they're up around 6 or 7 in the morning, so they get about 12 hours sleep. I know a lot of people with cockatoos find that 14 is actually a better time period for their bird to go to bed. And for this reason, a lot of people have a sleep cage and a day cage. The day cage is the main everyday. It's got the toys, it's got lots of space, there's food dishes in there. And it's what it sounds like. It's where your bird interacts with the family and spends the day. The nighttime cage, I often see people that still have pellets, but certainly have water available for your bird. Only 1 or 2 perches, and it's a little bit smaller. And it's kept in a dark, quiet room so that when your family is still awake, which many are at 7 and 8 o'clock at night, they're not interrupting your bird's sleep cycle because your bird's gone to their bedroom for the night. So whether this is a guest bedroom or an office or wherever you decide that you feel comfortable not going in for the evening. Again, some species need it more than others, okay? Your budgies and your cockatiels and some of the other birds don't seem to be as triggered by the light changes than, say, your cockatoos and your macaws do. And even within the species, again, it's an individual bird basis. So some birds are really, really triggered by it, and others don't seem to be phased or set off at all. So this is, again, know your bird. Aside from hormones, some birds can actually be quite cranky the next day if their sleep gets interrupted. So if you're having issues with your bird being a little less willing to cooperate occasionally, think back. One of the things you might want to consider was, what was the night before like in the house? If you had a lot of friends and it was loud and they weren't getting their sleep, then maybe they're just overtired. What else do we have? Yeah, don't panic. Keep an eye on it. There are some health concerns that you should be aware of. So if your bird has been hormonal for a long period of time, you have to be a little more careful and watch. Females, especially if they've been laying a lot of eggs, you're going to want to watch their weight and make sure they're eating food high in calcium to help them, because their body has to get the materials to make those eggs from somewhere. Proper nutrition, especially, well, for all birds, but especially for females, is really important, because if they don't have enough of the proper nutrients, the eggs can form soft and that's when we get into issues that are called egg binding. And that's where the female can't pass the egg properly, and that does require a vet visit. That's fatal to the bird and can be quite dangerous. So if you notice your bird's laying eggs and then all of a sudden looks like she needs to lay an egg, but nothing's happening, or if you notice, it could be on the first egg, your bird is very fluffed at the bottom, her bottom, and behaving oddly, it's always a good idea to contact your vet because you don't want it to be egg binding. There can be problems with prolapsing, even from excessive masturbation or screaming. And once this happens, there are surgical fixes for it, but it often reoccurs. So keep an eye on your bird. If they seem to be within the few, a month or so, that's considered seasonal, I wouldn't be concerned about it. But if you find your bird is having huge spikes in hormones every few weeks, every few months, then it's time to talk to your vet and start looking at how you can reduce it, because you want to prevent some of these fairly serious things from occurring. So don't panic. Most birds get through it just fine. They're just sexually frustrated, and it will pass. Just checking my notes. I think that's everything I had to talk about tonight. I don't see a lot of people online, so there probably won't be a lot of questions. It was kind of a surprise video, just to initiate the new page, and it was the topic that was on my mind. As always, if I spur other questions through a video that you see, feel free to message me. If there's a word you're not sure of, or if there's a question that you want to ask, that's what I'm here for. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. As we said before in yesterday's video, next week we're going to be looking at some of my toy making tips and some of the techniques that I use to make some pretty neat toys. So I hope you tune into that. I always get very excited about toy making and enrichment. It's one of my favorite things to do with birds, and hopefully you learned something tonight and you learn something next week. Oh, Annette, thank you. Oh, you are so welcome. I hope you all enjoy it, and make sure you spread the group. Make sure you like and follow the new page, otherwise you won't get notifications. It's set up a little bit differently from the group that we were in before. Facebook groups and Facebook pages are different, and hopefully the growing pains aren't too much and we're able to get everything sorted out. I really want this pages to work because it allows you guys to rate me and give your opinion of how things are going, and it allows you to message me directly through Old Bird. So I know that all the messages I get in there are behavior related versus the messages that I'm getting socially on my regular Facebook page. All right, so that's everything. Have a great night, and if you have any topic ideas or things that you would like to see more of on the page, message me that also. All right, bye now.